a chance to outbid them for that property, rather than just leave things sitting there doing absolutely nothing. But the first one you mentioned doesn't. What was the first one you mentioned? Because that does apply to it.
The chemicals they frack with, that no one can traffic, or no one will take it.
Yeah, so there's an economist I like named George Reisman who's got a good critique of environmentalism, and he makes the point that environmentalism is so pervasive now that we consider the word chemical a bad word. But chemical is like the basic constituent of nature. So it's often said, oh, well, fracking involves all these chemicals. And then unfortunately the oil industry, the gas industry kind of argue back, oh no, but 98% of it isn't chemicals, it's water, as if water is not a chemical, or water and sand, which is true. So 98% of what they're doing is water and sand, but I don't care at all if 98% of it is something else. The question is it objectively polluting someone else's thing, and then are you dealing with it in a way that respects people's rights? So there's no issue, there's nothing unique about these. These are just common, various different chemicals that have different properties, like the millions of other chemicals we use to do everything from lubricate to whatever. So if you look at, there are websites for this, I forget what they're called, but a lot of the companies just released every single chemical that they use just to kind of try to quell the opposition. Of course, it didn't work at all. No one stopped complaining. But it's just, there's like no magical chemical that is just this form of poison that's just going to kill everyone and we should be afraid of. It's just a question of, are you storing it responsibly? There's certainly nothing in there that can't be stored. I mean, you can store nuclear waste safely, you can certainly store that. So basically this is all propaganda, and it's anytime you hear something like kind of a buzzword like chemical or nuclear waste or something, where they're trying to make you scared just by a word whose definition that they probably don't even know, you should be scared, but not for the reasons, you should be scared of what they're destroying. So for instance, how many people know what nuclear waste is in this room? Yeah, okay, we got a lot. So, but yeah, I had this debate a couple weeks ago with Greenpeace, and the guy kept talking about nuclear waste, nuclear waste, nuclear waste. And at some point I just got sick of it, and I just said, who knows what nuclear waste is? And no one knew. I didn't think one person in the room knew. He certainly didn't know. But it's just, I mean, nuclear power, it just uses certain forms of atoms, which are called radioactive, which, as one person put it to me, it means they want to be something else. So they're in the state of breaking down. And because they're in the state of breaking down, because they're radioactive, it's easier to split them and generate an enormous amount of energy from them. So what happens is when we engage in the process of extracting that energy, you're left with something. And the byproduct is called nuclear waste. Now what turns out is most of that byproduct, the reason that it's dangerous is it's got a ton and ton of energy in it. So you have to be careful. You can't just go to something right near something that has a ton of energy. But they can do what's called reprocessing it and get a lot of that energy out and reprocess it, and get more and more of the energy out. And so then it becomes less dangerous. But the kind of scariness of nuclear waste is just that it's got a bunch of energy associated with it. It's not this kind of magical three-eyed fish creating thing. I mean, it can mutate. I mean, if you get exposed to an insane amount of energy, like right in your gametes, that's not going to be good for you. But nor is it going to be good for you to jump into a furnace. So these are just large amounts of energy. And this stuff really, it's a valuable question. If anyone ever says something to scare you, to ask, what is it? Because if you know what it is, it becomes less scary, and you can think about, okay, well, what are the objective problems associated with it, and how do we solve them? And with nuclear waste, it's again something that's viewed as, oh my gosh, it's scary. So to just go on this for one more second, I was talking to another person at Occupy Wall Street, and I said, do you know what nuclear waste is? And she was like, yeah, I do. And I said, okay, well, what is it? She said, well, it's got a, what is that thing called? And I said, it's got a long, what is that thing called? And I said, half-life? Is that what you're getting at? And she said, yeah, half-life. So they say, you'll hear about nuclear waste. It's got a long half-life. And she said, well, so it's going to be around a long time. I said, okay, well, is something scary just because it's going to be around a long time? And and if you're afraid of radiation, what's the relationship between a half-life and radiation? So a half-life is how long it takes something to break down over time. Now, if it breaks down very, very slowly, that means it emits a relatively very small amount of radiation. So if the half-life of the waste was a day, that's when you run. Not if it's 24,000 years. That makes it a lot safer. But these things are, the point is not, I expect you to remember every little detail of this, but to think about it and to question when someone tries to scare you with this kind of propaganda. And anytime someone tries to scare you and they won't really explain what's going on and how it works, it's no good. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that throughout the industrialization process that a society kind of develops a threshold for pollution and safety.
Yeah.
And that's based on the amount of wealth available. So there's going to be a point where, say, the government has to say, this is the threshold. This is the amount of pollution that's allowed.
Right.
So I'm trying to set this up to be as clear as possible. So with each method of extracting energy, you have positive effects and negative effects. So you have problems, and the whole thing is a positive. So what's a principle, or does it vary between each industry? But can you name the principle of law that would balance those positives and negatives to kind of name the threshold?
Yeah, so the basic principle of law is just the issue of rights. So it's saying that what your rights define your freedom of action. So that also means in what ways can and can't people interfere with you. And the basic kind of principle of rights is they can't coercively interfere. They can't use force to interfere with your freedom of action. Now, there's a question of, but that raises this issue. Is there any reason this door needs to be open?
I don't think so.
I'm not dodging the question. So force is a kind of physical, it's fundamentally a physical phenomenon. It's like I can't bash you over the head with a baseball bat. I can't dump something on your lawn. But it's not true that everything that kind of physically affects you is force. So for example, if I'm walking around, like let's say I have a cold right now, I'm not sure exactly why I'm coughing, I think it's just from too much speaking. But let's say I had a cold and you got sick. You can't say, oh, I violated your rights, because that's part of what you accept in terms of the human interaction. We both agreed to be on this property and whatnot. And even if the germs carry from my property to your property, it's not that, that's necessarily violating your rights. So in England in the 1800s, it was completely essential, and part of it depends on what is sort of inherent in human life at a given time. And that's where the state of technology comes in. So when you have to blast a lot of coal smoke and there's no other option, that's a requirement of human survival. So that can't be a violation of rights to engage in a requirement of human survival. But once it becomes technologically preventable in an affordable way, then you can say, yeah, it is a violation of rights, because you don't need to blow that smoke on my property, and yet you are. And that's what happens over time. So what you do is you set kind of now, there's a question of how to apply this in law, and this isn't my exact expertise, but you would have to have something that's based on the state of technology. And the only thing I would say as an application of that is that all forms of practical energy today fall within the realm of the legal and the rightful. So you can talk about, oh, maybe we should have this standard of sulfur dioxide or that, but in terms of, if you have any law that approximates we shouldn't be using coal, that law is complete garbage. And would taken worldwide, would kill billions of people. So but you could imagine a world in which, if nuclear power hadn't been completely destroyed by environmentalists, you could imagine a world, let's say nuclear in 50 years, becomes half the price of coal, And nuclear emits no CO2, which I don't regard as a pollutant, but it emits no actual pollutants either, no, nitrous oxide, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, you might be able to say, look, the amount of emissions by coal, that's unacceptable because it's completely unnecessary. But that's a future that environmentalists have completely denied us. So at this point in time, in this context, coal is clean. And not this kind of clean coal nonsense where you're going to somehow eliminate the CO2. But it's clean as in it cleans up human life, but as its net effect. Yes?
My question is about nuclear power.
Okay.
I know France is one of the leaders in nuclear power. I think something like 70% of all energy is created by nuclear power. What percentage of energy in America is created by nuclear power? And do you think that percentage of energy created by nuclear power is something that's going to grow exponentially in the future?
So in the percentage of electricity, I forget what it is in France, it's 60 or 70. In America, it's 20%. And whether it grows or not is largely a function of the government. So unfortunately, you'll often hear conspiracy theories about how the government wants to promote oil or the government wants to suppress the electric car, blah, blah, blah. None of those are remotely true. What is obviously true is that there is a worldwide hostility towards nuclear power. And even in France, it's something that's almost entirely controlled by government, which completely affects how and whether it evolves. And in general, the pattern of nuclear power has been to use kind of very old technology for a long period of time, to be overregulated and to be extremely expensive. So in France, it's not too expensive, but it's not too cheap either. So the evidence we do have, though, is that in the US in the 70s, it was producing, at least, by some arguments, it was producing power about half the rate of coal. And at that point, the environmentalists got involved and they basically made it impossible to do. So what you would expect, given that the basic technology involves something that's 1,000,000 times more concentrated than oil, you would expect that if people were free, they would find a way to do it more cheaply than anything else. And the amount of material that exists is, by all indications, far more relative to, say, fossil fuels. So the potential seems unlimited, but because there hasn't been a free market, it's so up in the air as to what it would look like. So I like to fantasize about what we could do with nuclear power, but all I can say is, the policy needs to change. The policy as it is now, it's not going to grow. I mean, I think Obama sort of like half approved some half loan guarantee for one plant in Atlanta or something. That's just, the problem is not giving the nuclear industry money, it's taking away all the obstacles that require them to have government money. So, for example, there's this issue of insurance. You'll often hear critics of nuclear say, oh, no one is willing to insure a nuclear power plant. Well, if it weren't, I guarantee you I and many other people would be more than willing to insure a nuclear power plant in terms of its actual safety. If you had because nuclear power plants are the safest form of power plants ever devised. In the United States, we have had 0 people die due to radiation, which is a record that no other power thing can compare to. The reason why it's hard to insure is because environmentalist lawsuits can completely bankrupt someone. So if you look at like what happened with the BP oil spill, where you have although many people have legitimate claims, many people don't, and they just kind of cash in, taking advantage of the fact that they're nearby and they can say they have damages. With nuclear power, it's just a complete cesspool of people. If anything, like if there's any disruption whatsoever, you can just sue, and we have a legal system that has such bad lawsuit laws that people would be terrified. So that's why. It's a completely artificial problem. Otherwise, as far as an insurance risk, you couldn't get any better than nuclear power, and historically the government has made a lot of money off insuring nuclear power. And as we know, it's not that easy for the government to make money on business ventures, but they've sort of had that one to do it. So the hypothetical potential is unlimited, and if we do our jobs, we can help actualize that. It should absolutely always, every environmentalist you run into, harass them about this issue. Because they claim to care about CO2, which I think is a relatively minor concern in the scheme of things in terms of the real concern is lack of energy. But if they claim to care about that and they oppose nuclear power, I mean, that's a hypocrisy that's worth pointing out. Were you saying something?
So what you're saying is that regulation gets in the way of making energy better? Like government standards that are put in place don't allow technology to evolve through like private.
Yeah, so there's a whole question of what, and this is something that, I'm not a legal scholar, so there's a lot to figure out here. But as much as possible, the government should not be like giving people designs and stuff. Like as soon as the government says this form of plant is approved, like this design is okay, this isn't, that means it's kind of creating this fossil that's going to be around for years, where the nuclear power industry is using this type of reactor versus others. It should be much more like like a general principle about like you have to have a way of containing the radiation, and then people can sue and say, hey, you're not containing the radiation, but it should be, scientific. That should be relatively scientifically easy to resolve. But for instance, I heard from someone who has a fair amount of expertise on this, that it actually doesn't make sense to make nuclear plants as big as they are, that it makes more sense to make them smaller. But because of all the approval hurdles, if you wanted to make them smaller, you'd have to get approval for all of these discrete ones, and that would take even longer than it takes to get a big one. So we're just fossilized into this thing. There are reasons why you would use different liquids in them besides water, which is the primary liquid. There are a lot of, energy should be like cell phones. It should be getting better in ways that we can't possibly imagine. And the more you have these arbitrary fears holding things back, the more you get locked into something that, was conceived of 40 years ago with radically inferior knowledge.
In shale, when they drill for shale, there's, I know down in the southern tier, one of the big worries that people always bring up is that part of the drilling process requires them to extract the rock or whatever they pull out, and as they go down further, some of the things that they pull out are heavy metals. Is that true, and how do they deal with that if it is?
I would imagine it would be true sometimes. You're drilling
Yeah.
a lot of stuff.
So I'm assuming they've found ways to deal with this, correct?
Heavy metals are desirable in a lot of ways.
You'd think so, yeah. Do you think there'd be industrial uses for them?
So, human ingenuity I just always find these things so weird. These people figured out how to make like a completely just like solid rock flow oil. The idea that they're going to have trouble dealing with heavy metals is a joke. There's no problem there's no problem in terms of, see, the great thing about capitalism, when it exists, is that all you really need to care about from our perspective is what does it cost, is it my best option? And then all he needs to care about is, his job is get them a product and follow the law. So they have to solve millions and millions of problems they have to solve millions and millions of problems that we will never have any idea of. Now, you guys are in college, but think about just how many problems you have to solve in your daily life that nobody knows about, that you have to think about. Imagine someone were to say, like, well, how are the students of Syracuse University going to deal with all these insane number of problems that they have to solve today? Like, we needed to form a committee to help them solve all these. They're all got to study for these tests, and they got to juggle all these things, and they're going to be feeling all these emotions at the same time. And well, the answer is that individuals solve problems, and that's their job, and in the aggregate, they do it in an incredible way. So you have, the whole phenomenon of fracking, from the discovery of the basic technology to the execution to incredible high levels of specification, all of that is a product of thousands or even millions of individual intelligent people. And there's also intelligence in the form of government, in the form of people initiating lawsuits. So part of how society works is there's some practice, a company isn't paying enough attention to it, and someone points that out. That's also an important thing. But it's a function of individual intelligence. It's not the kind of thing that we should sort of, from our perspective, say, oh, can they solve that or can't they? The way to know that is by leaving them free, having proper laws, and letting them do whatever they can. And there are going to be tons of problems they can't solve. for example, you might think that it would be really easy. The sun, Al Gore likes to say the sun, gives off enough energy every minute to power the entire world economy. Well, that's true. And yet, for 40 years, the solar industry has failed completely miserably at generating any kind of industrial scale power. Now, why is that? Because it's a really hard problem, and I could give you 5 reasons or 10 reasons why it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem because the energy is so spread out, so you need tons and tons of land and area, and work and all kinds of resources. It comes in sporadically or intermittently, so you have to figure out a way to concentrate and store it, which is insanely expensive. The voltage that it comes in is too low. It's dealing with a very fragile material that necessarily has to be outside, which is a pretty kind of stupid, I wouldn't say stupid, but it's a very challenging sort of starting point where you're basically, think about like the microchips in your computer, which aren't too different from solar panels. Like imagine if those things were exposed, how often your computer would stop working if those things were out of the air. So solar, you're basically dealing with these intricately complex and fragile things and sticking them in deserts, where they're having sand blown at them all the time. You're sticking them on the roof where you get dust all the time. And the fact, that accidental falls are one of the leading causes of death, so if everyone puts solar panels on their roofs, you're gonna have a lot more people die due to going up and cleaning them.